my beloved Batties, and welcome to another episode of Truth Behind the Tale, the series where I take a look at some of our most famous fairy tales and delve into their real-world historical and cultural origins. And today we're going to be taking a look at Sleeping Beauty. Even for those of us who are only really familiar with the Disney version of Sleeping Beauty, this tale has some pretty macabre origins, and it's one that is usually brought up in conversation to illustrate how messed up some of the original fairy tales could be before they were altered. But go back far enough with this one and we actually find quite a surprising and almost badass source for Sleeping Beauty. And it's a very interesting way to note how cultures have taken the tale and adapted it over the years to conform to what was seen as acceptable for women's behaviour. The earliest known version of the story, which would later tie into the Sleeping Beauty tale that we might recognise as a modern audience, first appears in Perseforest, which was an anonymous prose romance originally written in French in the 1330s. In this version, a girl named Zelandine was born and 3 goddesses were invited to celebrate her birth, not unlike the later tales. One of the goddesses placed the girl under a sleeping curse by pricking her finger with a splinter of flax, and many years later, while she was still asleep, the girl's lover came to her and tried unsuccessfully to wake her, but he was so taken by her beauty that he had sex with her anyway and left her pregnant. 9 months later, Zelandine gave birth to a son while she was still asleep, and the infant crawled around her searching for a nipple, eventually finding her finger, which he then sucked, and sucked out the piece of flax, which awoke her. This kind of reminds me a little bit of the original Brothers Grimm version of Snow White, where she wasn't woken with a kiss, but rather because her glass coffin was dropped and the piece of apple that was stuck in her throat became dislodged. The early fairy tales weren't really one for romance, were they? This version of the story was later taken and expanded upon by the Italian poet Basil and was published posthumously in 1634 as Sun, Moon and Talia. Zelandine was changed into Talia, who was the daughter of a great lord, and at her birth astronomers calculated her horoscope and predicted that her life would be endangered by a splinter of flax. To protect her, her father banned all flax from being brought into the house, but years later she saw an old woman spinning flax on a spinning wheel and was so curious with the process that she asked to spin a section herself. However, one splinter got caught under her fingernail and she fell into a death-like sleep. Unable to conceive of burying his dear daughter, her father placed her in one of his country estates, where she was eventually found by a passing king who raped her in her sleep. While she was still asleep, she gave birth not just to a son this time, but to a twin son and daughter. The daughter, just like in the previous version, sucked on her mother's finger and removed the flax, awakening her, and upon awakening she named the children Sun and Moon. Talia was again later found with her children this time by the king, but at this point he had already married, and after calling out the names of Talia, Sun and Moon in his sleep, the queen had the children brought to court with the intention of doing away with them. She ordered the castle cook to kill them, cook them up and serve them to her husband. The cook, however, took pity on the 2 children and hid them and prepared 2 lambs instead. After serving the meat to her husband, believing it was the children, she arranged for Talia herself to be burned alive, but Talia's screams alerted the king, who ordered his wife and all her conspirators to be thrown on the pyre instead. Again, this shows some similarities to the earlier versions of Snow White, where the queen didn't just want Snow White's organs brought to her, she also wanted them served up in a pie so she could eat them. The version of Sleeping Beauty that we will truly recognise, however, owes itself to the work of Charles Perrault. This story introduces the good fairies as well as the one evil fairy who was slighted at the christening, and went on to heavily influence the Brothers Grimm version of the story, Little Briar Rose. The Perrault and Grimm versions are the 2 we most commonly associate with Sleeping Beauty today, even if they are still pretty macabre, as well as the Disney version. But there is a possibility that the tale's roots, preceding even Perseforest, can be traced back to Norse mythology. And if this is a route, we can see how culture through the ages has changed the figure of Sleeping Beauty herself. The Volsunga saga is an epic piece of Icelandic prose which would later go on to influence J.R.R. Tolkien and composer Richard Wagner. Detailed in the saga is the story of Brunhild, who is seen as a shield maiden or even a Valkyrie. According to her story, her magical swan shirt was stolen by King Agnar when she was 12 years old, which forced her to swear an oath of loyalty to him. Because of this, during a battle between Agnar and his rival Hjálmgunna, she interfered on Agnar's behalf. This resulted in Agnar's victory, which did not sit well with the god Odin, who wanted his rival to win. As punishment for Brunhild's interference, he came down and struck her with a sleeping thorn and proclaimed that she must marry. But Brunhild responded by saying that she would only marry a man who showed no fear before falling asleep. Odin placed her on Mount Hindafjall and surrounded her by a wall of shields, not unlike the Wall of Thorns, which would later become popular in Sleeping Beauty tales. Eventually, after many years of slumber, Brunhild was approached by Sigurd, who managed to overcome the Wall of Shields and awaken her, with the two promising to marry each other. But Sigurd actually went on to marry another woman after drinking a potion that made him forget his earlier vow to Brunhild. So Sleeping Beauty, one of the most infamously placid females of any fairy tale, might have actually been a sword-wielding badass who was put to sleep because she angered the most powerful of the Norse gods. This story is suddenly a lot more metal than some of us might remember. Okay Batties, that's all I have for you today. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Please give it a big thumbs up if you did. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single video. And the next Truth Behind the Tale episode will be coming on the last Tuesday of next month. Thank you very much for watching. Have a nice day and I will see you very soon in another video. Bye!